What if the reason you're not learning fast isn't your memory, but the way you observe your own thinking? This is called metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. Most people chase study hacks, productivity tips, and motivation, but still don't improve, because the method is not the real problem. What matters most is how you think while using that method. Can you notice when you're actually thinking and when you're just reading? Can you tell why something feels difficult? Can you change your strategy when your current approach fails? That awareness is where real learning begins. In this video, we'll break down 3 practical parts of metacognition: how to build your learning radar, how to detect real mental effort, and how to shift from passive learning into active learning. Metacognition can be described as the ability to observe and understand your own thinking process. Every day, our brain processes information, solves problems, learns new ideas, and makes decisions. This entire mental activity is known as cognition. But when we become aware of how we are thinking, why something feels difficult, or which learning method works best for us, that is where metacognition begins. Imagine you are trying to learn a difficult topic. If you simply notice that the subject feels confusing, that reflects a basic level of metacognition. However, if you can identify why it feels difficult, perhaps your current approach is ineffective or your perspective is too limited, then you are using a deeper level of metacognitive awareness. At that point, you can deliberately change your strategy, shift your perspective, and explore a more effective way of understanding the problem. The greatest challenge of metacognition is that thoughts are invisible. No one can directly see what is happening inside your mind, and often even you cannot clearly recognize the exact thought patterns that are holding you back. Learning itself is an extremely complex process involving countless neural connections working together to store information, build memory, and transform knowledge into practical understanding. This is one of the main reasons why learning how to learn is so difficult. In most real-world skills, mistakes are visible. Whether someone is playing a sport, designing a machine, or building a project, errors can usually be identified and corrected. But during learning, the mistakes happen internally, making them far harder to detect and improve. Because of this, the first step toward improving metacognition is developing awareness. You need to pay attention to how you think when you struggle, what kind of explanations help you learn faster, and which methods consistently fail for you. Without this level of observation, it becomes extremely difficult to improve your learning ability in a meaningful way. Every person develops certain patterns of thinking over time. Some problems feel natural to us because our brain is already familiar with that style of thinking. But when we encounter a completely different kind of challenge that requires a new mental framework, we often struggle. Many people mistake this struggle for a lack of intelligence, when in reality the issue is usually an inability to adapt their thinking process. During childhood, the human brain is highly flexible. Children can absorb new ideas, languages, and patterns incredibly quickly because their minds are still adaptable. As we grow older, however, our experiences and habits become more fixed. These established patterns help us function efficiently in daily life, but they can also reduce our ability to think in entirely new ways. As a result, when life demands a new way of thinking later on, it may feel frustrating or overwhelming. Watching others learn something quickly can create the illusion that they are naturally more intelligent. In many cases, though, they have simply developed mental patterns that are better suited for that specific challenge. So, the limits we experience while learning are often not the limits of our intelligence, but the limits of our current thinking patterns. By becoming aware of those patterns, analyzing how we learn, and consciously practicing new ways of thinking, we can gradually expand our ability to understand and master new skills. That is the true power of metacognition. Most people assume thinking is automatic. They believe learning simply means reading information, memorizing it, and moving on. But real learning begins when you become aware of how your mind is processing information while you're learning. That's the foundation of metacognition. The challenge is that thinking itself is invisible. You cannot directly see your brain working, but you can notice the effects of mental activity through something very important: cognitive effort. Whenever your brain is forced to organize information, solve uncertainty, compare ideas, or manage complexity, you feel mental resistance. The task feels heavier, your focus becomes more intense, and that feeling is extremely valuable because it reveals the depth of thinking your brain is using. This is what I call building the radar. It's the ability to detect when your mind shifts from passive attention into active cognitive engagement. For example, imagine you're studying biology the night before an exam. If you simply read a definition like mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, your brain processes it with very little effort. You recognize the sentence, understand the words, and move on almost automatically. But now imagine your teacher asks you to explain why mitochondria are important and how they interact with other parts of the cell. Suddenly, your attention becomes much more active. Your brain now has to organize information, connect concepts together, and retrieve knowledge instead of just recognizing it. Now take it one step further. Imagine you're given a completely new question in the exam, something you've never memorized before. You now have to apply your understanding to analyze the problem, connect multiple ideas, eliminate wrong possibilities, and build a logical explanation under pressure. At this stage, your mind is doing something completely different. It's no longer passive reading or simple memorization. Your brain is actively processing relationships, reasoning through concepts, and adapting knowledge in real time. And that increase in mental effort is extremely important because it reveals the depth of learning taking place inside the brain. The more actively your mind is forced to think, connect, and solve, the deeper the learning process becomes. By learning to notice those shifts in mental effort, we begin understanding how our own thinking process actually works. Now, let's move away from mathematics and look at something more practical. Imagine you're reading a book. Most people read passively. They start at page 1, continue to the last page, and simply try to understand what the author is saying. It feels easy, relaxed, and low effort. But after a few pages, something interesting happens. Your attention drifts. You start daydreaming. Maybe you reread the same paragraph multiple times without absorbing it. Sometimes you even become sleepy. Why? Because your brain is barely being challenged. The level of mental engagement is too shallow to keep your attention fully activated. But now imagine changing just one thing. Imagine you know that after reading the chapter, you'll have to explain the ideas publicly in front of a group of intelligent people. They will ask difficult questions. They will challenge weak explanations. They will test whether you genuinely understand the material. Suddenly, the reading experience transforms. Now you don't just read sentences, you analyze them. You begin asking yourself, what does this actually mean? How would I explain this clearly? What questions could someone ask me? Am I missing a deeper implication here? And instantly, your brain becomes more active. The mental effort increases. But that increase is not a bad sign. In many cases, it's evidence that real learning is finally taking place, because your brain is no longer consuming information passively. It's restructuring knowledge actively. And the moment you learn to detect that transition, the shift from low engagement to deep cognitive activity, you begin developing true metacognition. The first step to becoming a better learner is to simply sit down and start learning something without overcomplicating the process. Don't spend too much time thinking about the best method or strategy. Instead, use whatever approach feels natural and comfortable to you. While studying, keep a sheet of paper beside you and divide it into 2 sections. One labeled A for active and the other P for passive. Your goal is to stay in the active state where you are deeply engaged with the material, thinking critically, exploring ideas, questioning concepts, or imagining that you are teaching the topic to someone else. This mindset forces your brain to interact with information instead of just absorbing it mechanically. However, as you continue studying, there will likely be moments when your focus begins to fade. You may suddenly realize that although you were reading, your mind had drifted away several minutes earlier and you were no longer actively processing anything. That is the moment you've shifted into passive learning. Whenever this happens, quickly make a note in the P section about what may have caused the distraction or loss of focus. Then consciously reset yourself and return to an active learning mindset. Repeating this exercise for even 1 or 2 hours can be eye-opening because it reveals how much of your study time is actually spent in a passive state without you realizing it. For most people, passive learning is the default mode, which is why so much study time becomes ineffective. The real purpose of this exercise is to build awareness and control over your attention. Once you can recognize when you're drifting into passive learning, it becomes much easier to pull yourself back into an active state. There are many ways to do this: testing yourself, summarizing ideas in your own words, creating mind maps, teaching yourself while learning, or drawing your own conclusions from the material. The specific technique matters less than the fact that your brain is actively engaged. True learning improves when you consistently force yourself to think, question, analyze, and interact with what you are studying rather than simply consuming information passively. If you're starting completely from scratch and you have almost no awareness of how you're actually learning, then honestly, the hardest part isn't using active learning techniques. The hardest part is building the awareness to notice when you've slipped into a passive state. And if you're studying consistently, let's say 10 or more hours a week, it'll probably take you around a month to build that awareness. To build that radar where you can quickly catch yourself zoning out, rereading without thinking, or just consuming information passively. But once that radar is there, the next step becomes way easier. Learning how to shift into a more active style of learning usually only takes another week or two. That's why most people don't struggle for years, because active learning is difficult. They struggle because it takes them years to even notice what they're doing wrong in the first place. So, step 1 is building the radar. Step 2 is understanding a little bit about how learning actually works. Because once you notice you're learning passively, the next question becomes, okay, so what do I do instead? And that's where learning theory helps. You don't need to become a neuroscientist, but you do need some basic understanding of how the brain learns, what makes information stick, and what effective learning actually feels like. Otherwise, even if you realize you're being passive, you'll just fall back on the only study method you know, usually something like mindless flashcards or rereading notes. So, if you really want to improve faster, focus on these two things first. Build the awareness, and then learn the principles behind effective learning. Once you have both, studying starts to feel completely different.